Thank you very much, Carol. The good news is I'm going to reduce 512 pages to 15 minutes, so it won't be painstaking. Is that a compliment when you said it was painstaking? I just wanted to be sure. I think it's appropriate that we're here in the Deco Library because this is really part of what was the larger plan for Rockefeller Center. If you were to draw a line from Rockefeller Plaza, the street that runs between the skating rink, what used to be a street, between the skating rink and the RCA building, which I will never call the GE building, it will always be the RCA building. If you draw a line from there, it goes straight up to the door of the Rockefeller Museum, namely the Museum of Modern Art, which was of course founded by Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. And the notion that Wallace Harrison developed along the way was that there would be a communications city at Rockefeller Center, and that this would be another center that would be for arts and culture. What became City Center was supposed to be here. The CBS building originally was supposed to be here, and it was going to kind of close off this grand triumphal way. That didn't happen because the 21 Club was in the way, and the owners, Prindler and Burns at the 21 Club, had more political power than the Rockefellers. They were able to stop it. The other way that the Deco Library comes into it, when this building was built, I think that's south, I believe, so that backs up to the 21 Club. You all know that 21 was a speakeasy during Prohibition. And once they were raided and they had to pull the lever that released all the bottles from the back bar down a chute and crashing into a basement. And when the excavation began for the Deco Library, it smelled like rye and gin. Carol asked me to set the historical context, which I hope that I can do with some speed. The context that matters most is what was there before. Midtown Manhattan in the 1920s became the Manhattan that we know today, in the sense that it became a city of skyscrapers, of business and of commerce, except for 3 square blocks in the middle, right in the middle, from 51st Street to 48th Street, from 5th Avenue to 6th Avenue. That was land that was owned for complicated historical reasons, page 27 through 29, by Columbia University. It was called the Upper Estate. They had owned it since 1815, and it had never been developed. It was just a bunch of brownstones, 228 brownstones, rent payers, that Columbia had neglected. They collected the money from the ground leases, and the city grew up around it. And if you look at pictures from those days, you see the Fred F. French building, you see the Empire State Building beginning to go up, the Chrysler Building in the distance, many other buildings that became the profile of Midtown Manhattan. And here were 228 really sort of lousy, by that time, condition brownstones. It was speakeasies, it was whorehouses, it was rooming houses, it was fallow, and it wasn't producing real income for Columbia University. That's when the people at Columbia thought that they could make some money out of it by having somebody develop it. Developers, I'm going to talk about how it came to be a bit. There are really 3 co-authors in my mind of Rockefeller Center, one midwife, and at the end a force of nature that I'll be addressing. I'm not going to talk about Nicholas Murray Butler, the president of Columbia, who set it in motion, whom Teddy Roosevelt called an aggressive and violent ass. Nor will I talk about David Sarnoff, the man who ran the RCA Corporation, who became the most important tenant, described by a contemporary as a communist's idea of a capitalist, nor Martha Graham, Benito Mussolini, Ben Shahn, or Edgar Bergen, all of whom played roles in the development of rock. I will talk about Edgar Bergen, I can't stand that. First, the midwife. That was Otto Kahn. For those of you who don't know about Otto Kahn, he was the Maecenas of New York in the first 2 decades, first almost 3 decades of the 20th century. Everything cultural in New York, Otto Kahn, who was a Wall Street banker, had his hand in, to such a degree that he even owned the Metropolitan Opera. It was his private business. He actually owned 91% of the stock. He had some friends who were involved in it as well. He did not own the old building. Those of us who are old enough to remember the Yellow Brick Brewery, as some called it, on 38th Street and Broadway, where the Metropolitan had been working since the 1890s. And he felt that the place needed a much better opera house where people could actually see the stage for more than 55% of the seats. He began the effort to develop a new opera house. But the people who owned the old opera house, a group of New York aristocrats called the Metropolitan Opera Real Estate Company, they really couldn't play ball with Kahn. He offered them a big piece of land behind Joseph Urban's Hearst Corporation building at the corner of 8th Avenue and 57th Street, and west from there, where the Park Von Dome apartment building is now. But the people who ran the real estate company, Vanderbilt's among them, didn't want it. They said it was too far west. Some people thought that meant it was too far from all the property that the Vanderbilts owned on the east side that could be benefit from having the Opera House built near there. There were people who thought that anti-Semitism was involved. Actually, Kahn had converted. Some people referred to him as the flyleaf between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But the reason they finally gave was that really the Metropolitan Opera Company could not have its house in the middle of a block. It had to be on a corner, and they were offended by that. Nicholas Murray Butler saw an opportunity here, and he brought in to the picture the first of the three co-authors of Rockefeller Center, John D. Rockefeller Jr. He's a figure sort of lost to most views of Rockefeller family history. We all know about John D. I, his father, who built the gigantic fortune, largest fortune in the world at his time, and we all know about the 5 brothers and the 1 sister in the generation of David and Nelson Rockefeller. John Jr., the son, once met Mark Twain, who called him a plain, simple, earnest, sincere, honest, well-meaning, commonplace person, destitute of any originality or any suggestion of it. On the other hand, he was about as public-spirited a figure as ever in New York. And the number of contributions that John D. Rockefeller Jr., who spent his entire career in philanthropy, never worked in business at all, that he made to New York, it's really countless. Everything from New York Hospital to the cloisters, to the Modern Art Museum, obviously, and then his one commercial effort, Rockefeller Center. He had no experience in development, he had no knowledge of architecture, and he didn't even like the opera very much, but he felt a civic responsibility. And in January 1929, he signed a lease that with its extensions would have lasted for 97 years for these 3 blocks of Midtown at a fixed rate of fundamentally $3.3 million. So he had some business sense because the Rockefellers were still paying to Columbia $3.3 million as late as the 1970s before a renegotiation. What he wasn't able to do, because he wasn't a developer, was something with the land. And that brings in the second co-author, John R. Todd, grandfather of Christie Todd Whitman, former governor of New Jersey and director of the Environmental Protection Administration. John R. Todd was one of the great developers of his time. He did a lot of work on the Upper West Side, a lot of apartment buildings on Riverside and West End Avenue, and then he moved into commercial real estate, and his great success was the Graybar building on Lexington Avenue. And the great success of it was that it was a money-making machine at a time that commercial real estate in New York was in an extraordinary boom because of the boom of the 20s. Todd was an entrepreneur, he was a bully. He had absolute disregard for architects, and said to one of the key architects on Rockefeller Center one day, he said, "For an architect, you show an almost human intelligence." He contributed several critical ideas in addition to fabulous managerial skills. First, he said, no opera house, and he did everything he could to persuade Jr., as John D. Rockefeller Jr. is known in family mythology, to persuade him that he didn't want an opera house there. The thinking was, if you have an opera house, in the daytime you have dead space. And he saw a commercial establishment in the middle of Manhattan, and he wanted it to be alive. He didn't want a big, hulking, empty building there. He was able to persuade Jr. to not go ahead with the opera house, largely because 9 months after signing the lease, the stock market crashed. The Depression was about to begin, and the grandees of the Metropolitan Opera Real Estate Company went to Junior and said, "Why don't you build us the house as well, instead of just giving us the land?" At that point, he said, "No thanks, I'll decide to go it alone," and brought in Todd. He wanted mixed use, he wanted high value, and he wanted to control the project. That was essential to everything that John R. Todd did. That's when he brought in the Associated Architects, 8 different architects who are named. You know, some of the names are up there now. And the notion behind it, actually, the 8 architects, one that's left out who deserves to be included there is Edward Durrell Stone, of all people, whom we don't generally connect with Rockefeller Center, but he did Radio City Music Hall, kind of the interiors particularly, as his own project. He also spent a great deal of time back there at the 21 Club. They said of Edward Durrell Stone, Ed Stone could draw anything but a sober breath. John R. Todd, he said about the architects that he hired, I like having a lot of people against me because the more there are, the more they get balled up and start talking at cross purposes, giving me ammunition to use effectively against them. And though there's a certain jocular tone to that, he was very, very serious about it. He became the person who would make all the major determinations of what would happen rather than the architect. He's effectively the planner. He's effectively the site architect. But among the 8 architects that he brought in, there was one who really is my third co-author, and I think the great genius of Rockefeller Center, and that's Raymond Hood. Raymond Hood was the antithesis of John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was a teetotaling Baptist and a very, very shy man. Also the antithesis of Todd. He was a man who was loved by everybody he knew, including most of the bartenders in Manhattan at the time, and by most of his clients as well. One of them said of him that life with Ray is a joyride in which everyone gets the thrill. One example of that, whenever Ray Hood was driving his car, as he approached an intersection, he would speed up. And his pastor, Ray, what are you doing? It's dangerous there. He says, well, that's why we have to get through it quickly. Somebody else said that Ray Hood's patron saint was a whim. And I think that's, though he was a whimsical guy, he certainly wasn't as an architect. He had a theory. The theory was summed in 3 words: congestion is good. He believed in the urban context. He believed in people being next to each other, that there was great virtue in that. He had a practical sense. That was best displayed as far as Todd was concerned when he had the ideas for the roof gardens on the lower buildings and on the setbacks of Rockefeller Center, because with the roof gardens, that would give a better view for the tenants, and Todd figured that was $1 per square foot more. And then aesthetically, and as an engineer, as an architect, and my colleagues who know more about this than I will talk about it, among his really brilliant ideas, if you look at this great blade of a building, the RCA building coming up, and you see the sides of it falling away, we've all noticed how it gets narrow as it gets to the top. That's where the elevators end, where each bank of elevators ends. And by moving the wall in from there, he was able to maintain no greater than 27.5 feet from any window for any office in the place, which made the offices that much more valuable. There's no interior space, really, that's lost to elevator shafts in Rockefeller Center, in the RCA building. When the plans were presented, Louis Mumford, the leading architectural critic of the time, writing in the New Yorker, wrote about it constantly. Every time a new piece of plan came forward or a building opened, he would write about it. I'd like to quote a few of what things Mumford said. I cannot find a word of even faint praise for Rockefeller Center. It is bad with an almost juvenile badness. This is 1933. The RCA setbacks of the building. He says, the little scratchy tooth marks the mice have left in their cheese. Overall, Mumford said Rockefeller Center was mediocrity through a magnifying glass. 1933, the depths of the Depression, 64% when the building opens up. Construction begins in 1930-31. 64% of people who worked in the construction trades in New York were unemployed. The president of U.S. Steel said, you can't even begin to realize how desperate we were for business. There was no construction anywhere. The Empire State Building had just been completed, and there was nothing else built privately of any size in New York until after World War II. It was only this project that kept the construction industry alive. They kept a lot of architects and draftsmen alive, and people who supplied the limestone and the glass and the doors and the doorknobs. Really hundreds of thousands of people around the country, and in some cases around the world, because of this project, because John D. Rockefeller Jr. could afford to do it. One of the other things he could afford to do was overbuild, which Todd gets credit for seeing to that this was done, so that they were able to save so much on the materials and to some degree on labor that they were able to do things that would have been uneconomical had things been at fair market price. For instance, making it possible to install air conditioning when air conditioning came along. One of the things that has kept it in great shape. Office space in New York had doubled between 1925 and 1929. With the addition of Rockefeller Center and the Empire State Building, it increased another 50% by 1933, and everything was empty. The Empire State Building, in fact, was called the Empty State Building. And Hood's own McGraw-Hill Building on 42nd Street. There were floors where kids would come in and roller skate during the day. But the Rockefellers were able to make this work, partly because of the depths of their pocket, and partly because of the force of nature that I mentioned. And that's a fellow named Nelson Rockefeller, all of whom we're familiar with. Nelson Rockefeller, at 21, returns from Dartmouth College, goes on a 9-month honeymoon around the world, where he met Mohandas Gandhi, and said in his journal he was surprised that Gandhi wasn't very interested in him. Came back to New York, walked into his father's office, walked up figuratively to his brother John D. Rockefeller III, who was a shy and timid man, batted him to the side and took over. He took over the renting program. He made certain that Rockefeller businesses like Standard Oil, obviously, and many others, the Rockefeller Foundation, that they came in and occupied the empty space. He brought in other people from all over the city by cutting prices, by underpricing everybody else in town, and did whatever he could to make the thing succeed. And he really drove it home. Among the other things that he did was he sought to the ouster of John R. Todd, because he knew that he could never really be in charge until Todd was out of the way. So finally we get to 1939, and in what is now the Simon & Schuster building, the last of the original suite of buildings, and they drive the last rivet. This amazing project is done. The Depression is over by now. Within 5 years, every inch of office space in the Rockefeller Center is occupied. The war boom fills it up. But there's this wonderful completed project, and Lewis Mumford steps forward again in the pages of the New Yorker, and he writes, "It has turned out so well, it could be considered a serene eyeful. It is the most exciting mass of buildings in the city." And he never bothered to explain why he had said anything different, or even that he had said anything different. I'll conclude with just a thought about Rockefeller Center today, and 2 reasons why I think that it remains such a great success. My esteemed colleagues will, I'm sure, have much more interesting and valid things to say about it. The first is that it was developed privately. I think that's absolutely essential to the story of it. That John R. Todd, with this enormous amount of money, could do what he wished to do, and didn't have to worry about satisfying a lot of people who had a lot of other interest in it. He saw a first-class development, he was determined to build it, he had the resources to build it, and was able to. What's interesting, and the second thing about it, is that it's part of the grid of the city. We walk through Rockefeller Center. You go from east to west, north to south, you would never leave the city. In fact, because it's privately owned, privately developed, privately owned and very well cared for today by Tishman Speyer, when you walk through it, notice, look down, the streets, there's no paper on the streets. The private cleaning crew cleans it up. There are no trucks waiting outside to unload, because there's a huge loading platform underground that you enter from 50th Street near the Associated Press building. It maintains the sort of things that, it maintains a quality that must be maintained if you're going to rent space at high prices. The discouraging thing to me is that the Rockefeller family, really responsible for this, didn't learn a lot from it. Lincoln Center was developed, the head of Lincoln Center was John D. Rockefeller III, Nelson's brother. There we see right now, partly it's being redone because it needs to be so badly. It's not part of the city. If you walk along Amsterdam Avenue, there's a Berlin Wall backing it that closed off the projects from it. It's set aside. And then there's the World Trade Center, where both David Rockefeller is involved in the Lower Manhattan Commission, and Nelson Rockefeller, as governor, were key figures in that. And that, too, separate from the city, publicly financed, dependent on public largesse, and a lot of people getting their hands into it. It's a tragedy, I think, that we have this great, great gem right here in our city, and that we haven't learned a lot from it. I said I'd mentioned Edgar Bergen and his role in it. The important thing that Edgar Bergen did was he made his first radio broadcasts from the Rainbow Room in 1937 and 1938, and became the highest paid entertainer in the country as a result. And I would like someone afterward, if you could explain to me how you become a huge success on the radio if you're a ventriloquist.